would like you to begin by telling us about when you first encountered the name Henry George and
All right.
the people you encountered in that.
All right. I first encountered Henry George when I was living in Kew Gardens, New York. One of our neighbors was Frida Osius, and Frida and her husband Matthew were both teachers at the Henry George School, and I believe that Matthew gave a one evening lecture on Henry George, but before I went to the lecture, my husband, who had studied at the University of Missouri, showed me that he had a copy of Progress and Poverty, the edition edited by Harry Gunnison Brown. So I took a quick look at it, but not very much. So that was my very first introduction, hearing Matthew Osius discuss the ideas of Henry George.
When did this take place?
This would have been about 1968, something like that.
And did you have any other encounters with Henry George's philosophy between 1968 and the time you started working for the Schalkenbach Foundation?
No, I had no more encounters.
Okay. Why don't you describe how you came to work for Schalkenbach? And
Well, I had resigned from teaching. I was completing the Great American Novel.
when was this?
This was 1978. And so time rolled on, became 1979. My son was in college. I was running out of money, and I took some temporary jobs. I was living in the suburbs of Larchmont, New York, and each time I would go in town, I would wander on different streets before I would take the train. And one day I wandered by the Henry George School and stopped in to say hello to Frida, who wasn't there, but I spoke to the registrar, Elizabeth, and we talked at some length, not about Henry George, and she suggested, she left Frida a message, and Frida called to tell me that we talked about my position, which was unemployed, and she said, well, there was a job at the Schalkenbach Foundation, but it was with this grouchy old man, but there might be some travel involved. So I said yes, I'd be interested. But I heard nothing. In the meantime, I was working, this was fall of '79, I was working for the General Assembly of the United Nations, a temporary job, sort of a glorious typing pool. And Frida called and asked why I had never contacted the foundation. It turned out that the school had never passed the message on. So I immediately contacted the grouchy old man, who turned out not to be grouchy at all. That was Oscar Johansson, the director. And I was interviewed, I guess, anyway, sometime in late December, at which time I was working nights for the Security Council, strictly on a temporary basis. And Oscar hired me on the spot, and I came to work for Schalkenbach the last week or two of December because both of the elderly women there were retiring, and the one younger person was not, didn't know all the ropes. So my first encounter, my first real knowledge of anything about Henry George came during that last 2 weeks of December of '79. And I started working for Schalkenbach officially in, I guess, January the 2nd or something of 1980.
Who were some of the people involved at Schalkenbach in that period? Not including board members, just the staff initially.
There was almost no staff. The Frances Soriero, who had been with the foundation since about 1935. She was Vi Peterson's assistant. Vi Peterson was the very dynamic executive director of the foundation for 20, 30, 40 years. And Frances had been a two-person team, occasionally with somebody clerical handling shipping or other kinds of extra tasks. And the only other person was a young woman who was a Georgist but had never worked before. We were located in the very beautiful Henry George School building on East 69th Street. We had a warren of small offices, so this young woman and I worked 5 days a week. Francis Soriero stayed in to show me some of the ropes, and then Oscar, I believe at that time, was part-time, I'm not sure, 2 days a week. Later went to 5 days a week. So most of the people I knew were the Henry George School people. The school was under the direction of Phil Finkelstein. Elizabeth, can't remember her last name, was the very wonderful registrar, and I've forgotten any other staff, but the teachers, it was mainly a night course program back in the early 70s, early 80s.
Since Vi Peterson was such an important figure in the history of the Schalkenbach Foundation, could you say any more? Did you ever meet her? What was your impression of her?
I met Vi at the annual meeting of 1980 in New York City, annual meeting of the foundation. But her fingerprints were all over the office in the way things were done, in the way that I think also in the way that the executive committee handled things, because Vi was very good at getting people to do what she thought ought to be done. She had a deep concern for the aims of the foundation. She had a deep concern for saving the foundation money, and she knew most of the board members in the early days, when Vi was also early with the foundation herself, were somewhat important businessmen. The men who had been named to the foundation in 1925, many of them continued to be on the foundation for another 20 years or more, and that's when Vi came into the picture. So she knew whom she could tap to write a speech, make contacts with other important people in the press or in activist circles in New York City. She herself didn't have wide contacts outside the foundation. I believe she was a workaholic and spent most of the time in the office. And she was a charming, efficient person with, I've forgotten the expression, velvet gloves with steel underneath them. She was English, and she traveled whenever she could, which wasn't all that often. I think Schalkenbach had no vacation policy, but 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if she felt like it, and some years no vacation. That doesn't give a very good description of her works in the daytime in the foundation. She wrote beautiful and very persuasive letters in the sense of explaining in great detail what ought to be done in her view, and how whichever man on the foundation she tapped to do it could best do it. So she was a very powerful person.
Do you have any sense of what her philosophy of sort of how to achieve the aims of the foundation were? Was she primarily focused on working with business people or with church groups, or did she mostly on publication, or do you have some sense of... I think it was
mostly publication and kinds of promotion of the publication, sort of by word of mouth of important men. I don't recall anything about church groups. I don't know that she had any particular club or church affiliations outside the office. I never heard her, I never saw any mention of these in her letters. But her aim was to keep Henry George's books in the public eye, to get his books or relevant pamphlets in the eyes of important people who could make some change. A lot of this, of course, never happened, but she tried mightily to do that, and she had good instincts for publicity, but the foundation never spent very much on that.
After you arrived in 1980, say in the 1980s, what were your what was your what were your daily tasks at the Schalkenbach Foundation? Because I think very few people understand what the foundation actually does on a day-to-day basis, and I think it would be helpful if there was any difference in the 80s and 90s, if there was any difference over time, if you could discuss that. But generally, what did you do? What was the function of the staff at that point?
Well, I used to say I did everything, including changing the toilet paper rolls, but we also had some hideous machine that copied things if it felt like it, where you had to put a big roll of pink paper on it and do all kinds of things to change it. And the copy came out on a silly piece of paper, so it wasn't very useful. We did everything. The American Journal of Economics and Sociology, which was an affiliated entity of the foundation, took a fair amount of the week's work. We worked, the two staff people worked 5 days a week.
Who were the two staff people?
Myself and Toby Altschuler.
Okay. But you were working with someone at the American Journal. I thought you meant that staff person.
Oh, no. The Will Listner and Dorothy Listner by this time he had retired from the Times. Will was the founding editor of the American Journal. They had retired and moved to Florida from New York. Daily, there was a lot of mail. So it was opening the mail, stamping the mail.
I guess I don't mean quite that level of detail.
Right.
What was the foundation? What were the major activities of the foundation in the 1980s?
The major activities were promotion of the books and related works by Henry George or about Henry George. We were also we helped finance the University of Wisconsin annual conferences on the taxation of resources and for economic development. So we had some contact with the university press because some of those books were still coming out. The most important thing I had forgotten was that I came to the foundation, let us say January of '80, and in the fall of 1979, before I was in the picture, had been the centennial of the publication of Henry George, with activities in New York City at the New York Public Library. Henry George's daughter, the choreographer, granddaughter, the choreographer, Agnes DeMille, had been prominent in some of the activities in New York City, and there had been a very large and successful conference in San Francisco to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Progress and Poverty. So now that we had published a centennial edition, and therefore we were in the process of publishing the other centennial editions of George's other 5 books. I believe the centennial editions tried to coincide with the exact 100th year of the original publication. So there was a great deal of activity between the foundation and the man who had taken over the job, I can't remember his name now, of designing the book covers and getting Phoenix Press, I believe, was the press. He handled all of those. These were reprints. Excuse me. With the new edition, with a foreword, usually by one of the board members for each of the new editions. I can't remember who wrote the forewords to any of the newer editions, but I think Lowell Harris, possibly Tommy Larkin, our treasurer. Lowell was our president at the time. I don't remember who wrote the other forewords, but each had a new foreword. And so the first, well, anyway, that was a good part of our time, getting these books reprinted and publicizing them, and also a big part of our life was the move. The foundation was located in the Henry George School, which had been sold, and we were moving to a new location, 5 East 44th Street, just off Fifth Avenue, between Fifth Avenue and Grand Central Station, just up the street from Brooks Brothers. And that involved anything that you were beginning to get to know a little bit, you almost immediately had to pack up and put away, because I believe we moved in July of '80, maybe June of '80, and left our little warren and moved into very, very large headquarters for the Schalkenbach Foundation. We had the entire 4th floor, and Oscar's office was way in the back, and the front office was for the then two-person staff. Later we had a secretary who came in 2 or 3 days a week and worked for Oscar.